I think there was somebody trying to start a recording earlier, and I wasn't able to approve that quite yet. But we will be recording this tonight and can get that to you later. So it's great to be together tonight. So glad you could all join us, and there'll probably be some others who will trickle in here shortly. But really grateful to have Mimi and Richard with us tonight for this conversation. And just a reminder that we'll be talking in part, at least, about this book worth celebrating that Mimi wrote about the legacy of celebration of discipline. And probably most of us here can tell us one kind of story or another about Richard, either in person or through his writing, about how our paths intersected and had an impact on our lives. And that's pretty wide ranging, as the book talks about. And I found it was really interesting. I was listening to the Renovari podcast, and Richard's son Nate hosts that, and he had found a letter in Carolyn, Richard's wife's original copy of Celebration, which was, he called, the Power Red edition of 1978. And there was a letter in there from somebody from England, thanking her for the copy and for her kind words, and the Richard's ministry as well. And it was signed at the end, Charlton Heston. And so that wide-ranging impact from Moses himself there. So that was
right.
that was a cool story. But but it's not just from famous people. It's from the less famous people like you and me. And so I'll just tell briefly my own journey with that. Was I grew up in evangelical Friends and Holiness Quakers, and many great people in that church that I grew up in. But sometimes it felt like it was this kind of spirituality of crisis that was altar call to altar call, and kind of hoping this will be the one that really
Yeah.
changes me. And in the midst of that, I was at Barnes and Noble, and I picked up this book. Was the 25th anniversary edition. Even though it said discipline in the title, I was still drawn to it, and picked it up. And I was a teenager, and so that weekend I went over to my friend's house and we played video games in his half finished basement. And at some point late in the night, he fell asleep, but I couldn't sleep. And so I decided to pick up the book and check it out. And I read it through the night and finished it by the time he woke up. And it was just a really life-giving invitation for me to explore these practices and this life-giving idea that we don't just have to try, but that we can train. And that's been formational for me throughout my life. But really, I was kind of hooked just from the first couple sentences of the book. And so I thought I'd start there, and maybe have a few moments of just centering silence, and then I'll offer a prayer and we'll jump into our conversation. But the book starts this way: superficiality is the curse of our age. The doctrine of instant satisfaction is a primary spiritual problem. The desperate need today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or gifted people, but for deep people. Present teacher, teach us to listen, teach us to practice, to train, and make us into deep people. Amen.
Amen. Mm.
Well, I think I'd like to start with you, Richard. If you wouldn't mind telling us about your spiritual journey among friends. I know that a lot of different Quakers and Quaker churches and meetings have shaped you and your journey, and Quakers always like having that insider baseball talk. So it'd be great to hear some about your journey there, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Well, first, let me just say I'm so glad for each one of you and the chance, even in this simple way, to connect. And my experience with Quakers is unlike what I'm sure many of you. Um, I mean, many, many years ago, we moved into Southern California, and there was a little Friends Church, Alameda's Friends Church. I walked right by it to go to school. I would walk through an orange grove, up the road, past what was then Alameda's Friends, to a little grade school. And I had an experience related to that orange grove. I walked through that for many, many years without any, compulsion to do anything. But one day I was tempted to steal oranges, not to eat them, just for the thrill of stealing them. Now, years later, many of you would recognize the St. Augustine story of the pear tree and his meditation on stealing the pears. Well, my experience with the oranges was very similar. And that was my first conscious recognition of sin. And so, anyway, all in that mix, we ended up attending this little Friends Church. Eugene and Jean Coffin. They called themselves a pair of jeans, and they were my pastors. I guess Eugene technically was the pastor there, but Jean pastored. And she was really the first recognition for me of a spiritual conversation, an interaction. And because she was willing to listen, I was a young kid, shy, didn't, and she somehow was able to draw out me and a conversation about all these kinds of things. So Jean was my first pastor, and then Eugene, a great leader, really, and a pastor of great power and love. And Eugene, he helped me craft my very first talk. It was a 10-minute talk on it was one of the parables, the sower and the seed. And he spent 2 hours with me thinking about how to share with people that parable. I went with, none of you would probably know the name, Homer Vale. Took a little group of us up to Kotzebue, Alaska, to help build the first high school above the Arctic Circle. I checked it out. They still use the building. I think it's a dormitory now, but at any rate, that was great fun, great experience. And because my parents, both parents, were quite ill and died in those teenage years, well, that was important because there were us three boys. Our dad was quite ill. I remember Eugene coming to our home and coming in. Our dad was in the bed, leaning over the edge of the bed, and Eugene got on the floor on his back and scooted under so that my dad's face and Eugene was just about 3 inches apart. And he said to my dad that he needed to get well enough to take care of us three kids. That was when our mom died. And anyway, that was a pastoral visit I'll never forget, never. And the words he said to our dad. So that, and because our parents were quite ill, and I was the last one to be with our mom before she died, the congregation kind of wrapped their arms around us three kids. Can you think of that? And my older brother was a nurseryman in a plant nursery, really all of his life. A very large nursery. And he would hire me at Christmas time and so on. This was Newport Beach, and the Christmas trees were very expensive. And I remember him walking by carrying a tree, and the people who'd paid $500 or whatever for it. And he would say, well, sold another dead tree. And he would do that kind of stuff with people. And my brother was really quite wonderful. Then I was the middle one, then the younger. But after the experience up in Kotzebue, I shared with, I guess it was the youth group, and those people that were in charge of that took me home and asked, because I had all the money that I had saved for college and so on had been spent on medical bills, especially for our mom. And so I enrolled at a local junior college, and I applied for a job at Allstate Insurance. And then I went home with this couple that took me home after I had shared about our experience. And they asked if you could go to school anywhere, where would you go? And I said instinctively, hardly knowing what I was saying, George Fox. And within 3 days, they had gathered a group to cover the expenses for that. And that's why within a week, Allstate called and said, I had the job. I said, sorry, I'm going to college. And away I went. And that little group, which was in that church, the Quaker men, stood by me all through college and through 3 years of graduate work. I did 6 years of it, but anyway, those kind of connections stayed with me. I would send. This was before the days of even cassette tapes, little reel to reel. I would get them and just record a message to the little Quaker men that they would play at their meetings. And I did it all through college and graduate school. So they were very good to me and us as a family when our parents died. And anyway, so that was my introduction to Quakers.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. So then did you trying to get the timeline here, at some point you were at Friends University, and at some point you were pastoring in California?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, they had me work at the church. I mean, they were very kind. One time I worked, one of the members who was an electrical contractor hired me for the summer just as sort of an apprentice. And then another summer, they had me work with the youth group. We had a pretty good group of 100 or so. And it was, and I began to speak. I felt that if I could have something to say, content-wise, and an ability to say it, that I'd have something rather unique in our culture. And so I trained myself in rhetoric and did tons of speaking. I made a little promise in those days. Oh my, it would do me in today, but that I would not turn down a speaking invitation unless there was a direct conflict. So for
Oh,
a number of years, I spoke in lots of places and lots of venues, and so those were, and I was tied. I mean, the Alameda's Friends Church helped, and I mean, I got jobs and I worked and so on.
mhm.
Um, and then, I mean, I went to graduate school, and then there was an invitation for a Friends Church in Southern California that needed pastoral leadership, and they invited me. That was lovely. The former pastor put his arm around me and says, "It's your turn to be in the desert." And we learned so
Oh,
much
wow.
those years. Yeah, it was lovely,
And
lovely
that's
group.
that's where you met Dallas Willard, is that right?
Dallas and Jane and their two kids, John and Becky, were there at that church. He knew more about Quakerism than just about anyone I had ever met.
Hmm.
And he wanted to see if there was any genuine expression of that alive, because he had read, Fox's Journal and all that kind of literature. In fact, he taught some of that stuff for us. When when I would teach, folks might come, but when Dallas taught, we all brought our tape recorders. For
Yeah.
those who don't know, Dallas
Yeah.
Willard was a professor of philosophy at USC, and just a dear, dear man. And it began a 40-year friendship that we had and worked together. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
So,
I didn't
yeah,
realize that's to hear what had drew him to
yeah. He
Friends.
wanted to see if
Yeah.
what he had read in all of the early Quaker stuff, if there
Yeah.
was any expression of that alive today. And that's why he was at this little Friends church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a
Now,
lot of us are still asking that question, still seeking after that.
yeah, well, it was lovely. For example, I mean, he was a world-renowned philosopher in phenomenology. And, but when I went there, I found him with a gentleman who had a third grade education. He was a construction worker.
Mhm.
And Dallas and this fellow would meet every week, uh, just the two of them, to
Mhm.
study the Bible together. So it was it was sweet just to watch them because he couldn't have understood any of Dallas's philosophical work, but there he was, and and I just found that so lovely,
Mhm.
lovely, and yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the church gets a lot of bad press these days, often, unfortunately, deservingly. But it's things like that of the cross, cross generation or cross class relationships and the caring for people who are experiencing loss. It shows that there's still a
yeah,
lot of beauty in the local church and local
there
meetings.
is.
So
Yes, yes, my experience was very positive. Yeah.
yes, okay. So tell us then about how you came to write Celebration of Discipline. Now, by that time, you were up further north.
I was, and I had, well, I'd been teaching about these things, but here's what I saw, that people were scattered. They weren't gathered. People were myopic, had a myopic vision rather than a synoptic vision. And people needed uh, a conceptual way of that would work right into the lives of folks. And so I would teach on this stuff. Carolyn would, uh, we'd go out to dinner and I'm talking about fasting. I'm sure I was it was,
Irony.
and finally I felt I needed to write it down. I wanted a General House publisher that had a religion division because the hope was to speak as broadly as possible. And so I wrote it down.
Yeah.
And wonderfully, the House of Harper and Row in those days, picked it up.
Hmm. Great.
I think Mimi knows a little more about that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's bring in Mimi at this point. Would you like to, well, first of all, you tell us a little bit about yourself and then how you came to write a book about a book. I mean, that's a new concept for many of us.
Thank you for what you said earlier, Andy, about your experience. You talked about the going up for the altar calls. And I grew up in a context as well, a variety of churches when I was growing up. And I asked Jesus into my life over and over, hoping that this time it would take, because there was a gap between what I knew was possible and my ability to reach it. And so I figured there's nothing wrong with God and there's nothing wrong with the Bible. So the problem must be in me. I just don't have the right stuff. So I went to seminary because I had had an encounter with Jesus and I just wanted to learn as much as I could about him. I went out of love. I went out of curiosity. I didn't go with any idea of any kind of professional result or anything like that. I'd never seen women do anything in the churches I was part of except teach
Mm.
children in Sunday school. So I didn't have any vision for that. I didn't have any draw to it. It just was blank.
Hmm.
I was just graduating from seminary when Richard published Celebration of Discipline, and I picked up one of those fiery red books in the bookstore. And the thing that drew me to it was how the oxymoron of the title, Celebration of Discipline, didn't go together at all. And so I was curious and I thought it was humorous. And then I opened it up and looked at the table of contents and realized that what I saw there was what I was searching for, a way to really be transformed from the inside out and become more Christ-like, because I had all my learning, all my training, all my reading. It didn't penetrate. It couldn't get below the thermocline of my heart. It just couldn't punch through.
Mhm.
So I did like you, Andy. I took it home and I read it. And then I read it again. And then I read it again. And I started putting these things into practice. And it's not that I didn't know about daily devotions and, reading scripture and prayer and going to church, those things. I'd certainly been trained to do those things growing up in a Christian home, but this was different. This was a way to actually put myself in a place where I could actively cooperate with the transformation that the Spirit was doing in my heart. So I was pretty well formed by Celebration of Discipline before I had the opportunity to attend a conference where Richard was speaking. It was a week-long conference. And I listened to him, and he put language around what I was experiencing and helped me understand how I could be even more intentionally cooperative and to name the things that I'd already been doing in the congregation that I served without having any idea about spiritual formation. I'd never heard of it. So Richard and I, after that, developed, Renovari moved from Wichita, Friends University, to Denver at that point. So he wasn't very far away. Renovari wasn't very far away. So our church started participating in conferences, doing, helping with registration and book sales and that kind of stuff. There was a lot to do. And then after a number of years of participating and growing in friendship with Richard, I was invited to serve on the board of Renovari, which I'm now doing. But you ask about writing a biography about a book. I never heard of that either. I thought it was kind of a strange idea when Richard came to me and said, have you heard of book biographies? And I said, no, what is it? And he said, well, it's a biography of a book. Kind of obvious. And I said, why? And Richard said, well, he was contacted by Roy Carlyle, who had been the person that Richard connected with back in probably 77, about his idea of a book. And Roy was one of the editors for Harper, and Harper San Francisco, and he took it back to them. They ended up publishing it a year later. So Roy was the one who contacted Richard about a book biography. And Richard then came to me and asked me if I knew about them. And when I said no, he said, well, it was started by publishers because they want to know what makes a bestseller. So it came out of, and it was focused on publishing. What makes a book a bestseller? So it's published year after year after year, international translations and influence. And the third category box that needed to be checked for a book to qualify is it had to have started a movement of some sort. For example, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring started the EPA, Environmental Protection, whatever it is, whatever the A stands for.
Agency, yeah.
Thank you. So Roy came to Richard in
That's
2019. Yep.
That's what the A stands for, EPA.
All right. Yeah.
Environmental Protection
Agency. Right.
Now
So-
I'm gonna step into this for a minute.
Okay, go ahead.
Because
This is all about you.
I will
Yeah.
allow it.
Oh, it's not. Y'all need to know now. Mimi was one of the first women pastors in the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church, and for over 30 years, about 33, 34 years, pastored one church in Golden, Colorado, and was there, went through all of the kinds of ups and downs. She studied and knew Quaker stuff well, and I was so impressed watching the development of what she did with this congregation for over 30 years, and how that worked. I mean, Carolyn and I were some distance, but we would attend now and again just to watch Mimi, see what's going on, see what a congregation, the formation of a congregation into the life of Christ. And watching that for many, many years was why I approached her about a book about a book. So,
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Well, I had a good teacher. So we field tested. The thing about Woodlake, the first place where Richard went and worked with Dallas, that became a living laboratory for formation. And
Hmm.
this was a congregation in the 60s and coming into the 70s that really reflected the culture. And the shift that happened in that, I talked to people who had been in the congregation as part of writing this book biography, and to see their faces and have them describe what happened as people actually changed. They became, as Dallas would say, a different sort of person. So
Hmm.
I was experiencing this in our church without any language or any way to understand it, or anyway, it's like Richard. I started practicing these things deeply before I ever brought it to ministry. And I didn't do it in order to shape a formational church. I just did it because what I was experiencing was so alive and so good and so rich. And lives were being touched in such a deep way. People would come in that were really knuckleheads, very wounded, a lot of trauma. And they were starting to get well. We were getting well together. We regularly went through celebration of discipline classes, experiments, congregation-wide experiments in each one of the disciplines. And it takes a long time. Richard will be quick to say that. It takes a long time, and all of us know that. It's like braces on an old person. It takes a long time for things to actually move and for the bite to change from being one that's hostile and self-protective to being one that's kind and nurturing. So when Richard talked about this book biography and he said, what would you think about a book like that? And I thought he was just asking. I said, I'd read a book like that in a heartbeat. And Richard said, why? And I said, because I'd want to know where it came from. I'd want to know the backstory. And at that point, Richard's always been like Barnabas in the New Testament, always focused on encouraging people and lifting them up. Very little real access, except through his books, to himself. He's always looking out here, always encouraging. So I said, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about where this book came from and your experience. And Richard said, well, book biography is about the book. It's not about the author. And I said, well, the author's got to have a piece in it. And besides, I would love to hear that story. I'd love to read that story. And then Richard said, how about you writing the story? And I said, no, hard no. I'd never written anything. I didn't want to write anything. And really, the thought of the weight of trying to put into words what this book had meant in my own life was so intimate, so personal. And the way that I'd seen it work out in this community was so intimate, so personal. I couldn't imagine writing about that. That just felt, I told Richard, I don't want to booger it. He said, you don't want to what? I said, I said, I don't want to booger it. And Richard thought, he laughs a lot. He thought that was hilarious. I didn't think it was hilarious. So anyway, he gave me 2 months to think about it. Richard doesn't push. And then he called me one day and asked me what I thought. And I said I was inclined to accept because Richard had said, you can ask me anything and I will answer your question. And I'm going to put you in contact with some of my dear friends and people who were part of the formation, like Howard. And you'll have a chance to sit down with Howard and some of my college friends, and I'll give you names, anything you need. I can give encouragement. Richard did not edit or ghostwrite this book. He did read through it, and if there was something that he felt I didn't quite capture, then he would call me up and tell me to come down and sit on his deck in the forest, and we'd talk about it. So it's fact checked. It's most, I don't really know, and maybe some of you know, I don't know of any book biographies where the author is still living. This
Hmm.
is, to my knowledge, the only book where the author is still living. Thank God. And
Hmm.
Richard, you don't have permission to go for a long time. We need you.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how I got into the book. I feel like writing that book was like sitting down with Jesus and building a kite where he shows you where to put the glue and hold on to it until it sticks. And he has the fabric pre-cut. And then at the end, he said, let's see how this thing flies. So it was hard
Hmm.
work. And there were lots of times when I didn't have any idea how to proceed, but I just feel like this book was Jesus's idea. And I know this is a question that you've had for me, Andy. I think that it's more relevant and important today than it was even in 1978 when it was published, because things have continued to fracture. And
Hmm.
the hunger people have for a deeper life with God has only sharpened and spread. So
Hmm.
it's become it's a famine, and this book speaks directly to how we can place ourselves before God and cooperate in our transformation and move into an intimacy with the Trinity. I love
Hmm.
this book.
Hmm.
Grateful for
Yeah,
it.
I think it really reaches, it's that the deep calls to deep
Mm-hmm.
idea. I think it's speaking to that deep place within us, that deep hunger that we all have. And if it's, some books are about topics that are very specific to a time and era, and that's appropriate, that's helpful, that's fine. But sometimes these books that are speaking to that deeper longing are the ones that endure, it seems like.
Well, and if I could add one thing, what Richard did when he was pastoring as a brand new pastor, pastoring a group of people that had real wounds,
Hmm.
he goes back, and he was introduced to this at George Fox. He goes back and he studied the devotional masters to see what people did in similar times. What did they
Hmm.
do? And he gathered their practices. And of course, they were doing what Jesus does. And so
Hmm.
when he wrote these things, Richard didn't invent them. What he
Right.
did is he brought them forward and expressed them in a way that put them in our hands so that we could experience. Now it's our turn. Now we can experience what it takes. We can follow Jesus into practices that enable us to be lights in the darkness.
Hmm.
So that's what I loved about it.
Yeah, it's kind of a retrieval of some gifts from the past that maybe have been neglected or lost, and
Mm-hmm.
put gathering those together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm not sure if we've lost Richard. Are you still there, or do you need a second?
Oh, no, I'm here.
Okay. Speaking of
I
that
often,
time,
I often said to people that if I've said anything new with celebration, that I apologize.
Mm,
hmm,
We wanted to just bring the great tradition, and Quakers are deeply a part of all of that,
mm-hmm.
uh, uh, to the contemporary scene as best we can. So I never tried to do anything new, just
yeah,
recover what has been there for centuries and give it a fresh expression if I
hmm.
could.
One of my other favorite writers is Douglas Van Steer, a Quaker writer, and I was actually curious if he had shaped you at all, because he has that same kind of style that's rooted in Quakerism, but it's very ecumenical, drawing from especially
Yes,
some of the mystics and saints from other traditions.
yes. And I wrote to him about celebration
Oh,
because in one of, I forget which book it is, where he said that uh, for a fresh recovery of Quaker thinking, we need to go back to the great disciplines of the spiritual life. So I wrote and said, I'm working on that.
Yeah.
Now, at
Right.
that time, I just had, uh, whatever, ideas and sermons all over the place. Now, Mimi, she's Presbyterian. She would write out her sermons, but me, I bring a napkin and with a few notes on it, preach it.
Did you hear back from
Yes,
Douglas?
he
Yeah.
was very kind to just write, and
Hmm.
that was toward the end of his life, of course, and to encourage me on with that.
Hmm.
Yeah, Douglas Steer was sure a great one in our tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And Elton Trueblood, he was a real
Uh-huh.
encouragement to you.
Yes, yes. It was at a conference. I don't know, Howard, if you were there at that conference. It was, where was it? St. Louis or anyway, I stayed a while afterward to do sermon prep and stuff. And then at that hotel, and I go down to this was after the conference, stayed an extra day and went down, and there was, many of you anyway knew of Elton, and there was a group around, he was, holding forth in the middle of that hotel. And he said to me, Richard, come. And he handed me a sheet of paper. He says, read the first two paragraphs there. Well, I start to read them, and he goes, no, out loud, out loud. It was, I think, a speech he was going to give somewhere. And so I read it out loud. And then he did this publicly. He looks at me, he says, now, what book are you writing? And I said, oh, no, I'm writing a few articles and so on. He said, good, but soon you must write a book. I didn't
Nice.
realize that he said that to everybody.
Yeah.
And some of them wrote.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so I actually went and wrote up a 12-page summary of what is now Celebration, and asked his advice on it. And he wrote me back, very kind. And the one important counsel he gave was make sure that every chapter forces the reader into the next chapter.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Good
that was
advice.
our contribution.
Maybe that's where Dave Kingery, Dave Kingery
Mm.
from,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, I do.
I had him as a professor, and one day he called me into his office and said, I think you're a writer. And I said, oh, that's very kind. He says, I think you need to be writing. I said, okay, well, I'm open to doing that. And he said, no. Right now he calls over to Barclay Press and gets somebody on the phone and says, I've got somebody who's going to start writing devotionals for Fruit of the Vine. And they're like, oh, okay. So right there on the spot, he was like, hey, we're gonna do this. And
I'm sure he picked that up from Elton.
yeah, he was always talking about Elton.
Yeah.
Many of you, I think, knew him.
Yeah, of course he has a
Oh, that's
legacy at Earlham School of Religion. So
Mhm.
well, speaking of that kind of timelessness, the part that maybe you wouldn't think would be timeless would be that word that Mimi mentioned, the disciplines word. And sometimes I've for myself, and I know some other people have shifted more from talking about spiritual disciplines to talking about spiritual practices.
Mhm.
But in your letter to yourself that you wrote as part of the book, you stick to your Quaker guns on that one, though. And the discipline's still an important word choice. You want to say more about that?
Well, let me just say a couple of words. I understand the interest in the word practices, spiritual practices. It's a more inviting word, isn't it? It's comforting. It has a lot of good qualities to it, but it is also a weaker word.
Hmm.
It does not have the same strength. Now, it has a more positive attitude culturally. But I like discipline because historically, it's a great term. The disciplined person is the person who can do what needs to be done when it needs to be done.
Hmm.
Now, I can take a basketball and I can get it into a basketball hoop, but I can't get a basketball into the basketball hoop when it needs to be gotten into the basketball hoop. That is,
Hmm.
I'm not a disciplined basketball player. Used to play tennis some, and I would practice tennis, but I am not a disciplined tennis player. Uh, would love to have played with, do a set with John McEnroe or somebody. Um, no, it wasn't the person. Who was it? Oh, it doesn't matter. I couldn't make a point because I'm not a disciplined tennis player.
Hmm.
Um, now, let me just work on this just a little bit. You remember the early Christians spoke of themselves as the athletia Dei, the athletes of God. Hmm?
Hmm.
I mean, think of athletes training for the Olympics. I mean, for me at least, practice doesn't quite get me there. I need rigor. I need intentionality. And so the word discipline, I think,
Hmm.
uh, helps us to see that there is a deep intentionality that isn't just, oh, I practiced on that. No, I I want to develop the inward life outwardly, the with God life, so that it's a deep discipline of life that flows, so that when I'm on the spot, I can do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Now, if practices will get you there, I'm all for it.
Hmm.
Let's just make sure we have the life and the intentionality. Um, I'm thinking of what's his name? A series called To a Devout and Holy Life.
Hmm. Is that William Law or?
William Law.
Yeah.
And I read that sucker, and his understanding of devotion is so much richer and deeper and more expressive than what we think of today as devotion.
Hmm.
So anyway, I'm
Hmm.
happy to stick. Feel free. Maybe the word training.
Hmm.
Training. We're learning to train in life, but it isn't. It isn't an optional. It is a. It is a moving into a life with God.
Hmm.
Hmm. Well, anyway.
I like that. That's and like I said earlier, that was just that principle. And I know that Dallas talked a lot about that as well, about training versus trying, and that was really helpful for my own formation. Um, but also, with those images is the coach need for coaching.
Uh-huh.
And actually the first time I ever heard of spiritual direction was at a Renovari event, and we were at these round tables for, I think, a meal or something, and these Catholic folks were talking about it, and that was the first I'd ever heard of it, but turns out to be something that has been really helpful in my own life. So maybe on that note, if either of you want to say a word about how this became a more of an ecumenical kind of movement.
Well,
Yeah.
I want to say on that, I intended from the absolute outset to reach, to give us basic Christian faith as broadly as possible. And so it isn't like I started this way and it moved this way. No, from the very beginning, we all who name the name of Christ, see, and I know that there's a great variation among Quakers about this, but my Christology is very high on this level. So we want to speak to the whole world as best we can. Now we are expressly Christian, and so the high Christology, there's a reason for that. And yeah. I was thinking of James Naylor. Remember him? I mean,
yes.
His book, The Lamb's War Against the Man of Sin. I was able to read a first edition of that. Had put on gloves, and it was at the Huntington Library. And see, Naylor, he went too far, I know, but I mean, back to that discussion of practices versus disciplines. I don't know. His Lamb's War was a disciplined effort to follow Jesus.
I think that's a great transition to one of the last questions I want to make sure to ask. But before that, I wanted to just check with Mimi. Was there anything else you wanted to add to this conversation about either discipline or the ecumenical spirit of the movement?
Yes, thank you, Andy. I guess that the thing that I wanted to add is that one of the criticisms that celebration of discipline drew had to do with with the idea that this is all turned in on yourself, that the disciplines are all focused, incurvatus and say, all turned in on yourself. And that it's people sitting around humming and sitting in a cave and having their candle and all that. But the thing that struck me so much in when, like Dallas, I went back and read Fox. I read the original words where they were trying to describe, put into words what they were actually experiencing together in worship. That it was like they went from warming themselves at the fire to actually being on fire. And then they carried that flame out with them to aspects of society. So like Woolman, Richard wrote his dissertation on Woolman and his effect on the huge role he had in the abolition of slavery in the United States. Quakers were people that led that charge, that were starting hospitals, that were finding people that were unseen and marginalized and coming around them and responding to them as would Jesus. And that's the thing that it makes Quakers so attractive to me. It's not just this inner thing, but it finds expression in the way that we are with one another and our expectation that God is going to be present in all of us as our living teacher, Savior, Lord, and friend, and that together we're going to hear the word of the Lord, not some celebrity only, who is the one in whom the word of God is planted, and you have to go find that prophetic celebrity person. But there's an
Mhm.
expectation that the image of Christ in each one of us is something that can be fanned into flame the way that Eugenia did with 10-year-old Richard Foster.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, this little boy caught the fire and it started to burn. So, one of the things that we think about is, where do we start in sharing this? You share it where you are, but you implant it in your kids and your grandkids, in children. You help them to see themselves through the eyes of God as the beloved, the chosen, the carrier of the life, the light of Christ. So this is one of the things that the critics didn't really understand. They thought it was a withdrawal from society. But in fact, it was a way of recovering the image of Christ in us so that we can engage and make a difference. And that's one of the things that Quakers have done from the beginning. That's why I think it had to come from a Quaker. This book had to come
Mhm.
from a Quaker. It was
And
rooted.
Wow.
the importance that we do it together,
Yep.
Mhm.
the corporate nature of all of this. That's why, at least as I organized it, the 1/3 of the book was on the corporate disciplines and how these things work their way out.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that there's a deep social dimension to all of this. That's why when my editor came and said, well, if you write any other book about these things, what would it be? And I said, simplicity, because we have to, these are not pious exercises for the devout. They're a trumpet call to a
Mhm.
radical way of living. So I knew at the time that it wouldn't be a particularly popular book. But
Yeah.
that's what we're after anyway. We write for what can really help people.
Yeah. Well, Mimi, I just wanted to say I really like your images. You're really good at bringing out those. I like the warming around the fire, then the fire within, and the one about the adult braces.
Yeah.
That was a good one, especially because many of us have been bitten before, so that resonates. But yes, that's great. That's you all pretty much answered the question I was getting at, which is, you do talk about critiques of the book in the book, and from kind of one wing of Christianity is more the conservative wing, saying this is too Catholic-y, new agey, whatever. And then kind of on the more liberal wing, it's kind of like, oh, this is navel gazing spirituality. What's this got to do with social justice? So I think you addressed that. And the Lamb's War, that these are all connected, all part of that same spiritual movement.
Mhm.
So but I want to make sure people, I'm sure there's questions and comments that people want to share. So I just want to ask one more question, and that is, um, for either of you, what advice would you have to give to the Quaker leaders of various kinds who might be listening today or watching this video later?
Here is a great opportunity. We have examples of leaders today that is horrendous. Manipulation, control, managing, intimidation, all those kind of things. And that's not real leadership. So the first thing that Quaker leaders need to do is lead. And the people uh, need to be open to that, for leaders to actually lead, but to lead with compassion, with love, with joy, with peace, to lead in a way like Jesus led. You remember it was said of Messiah that he would not break a bruised reed, nor quench a smoldering wick. Jesus would never snuff out the smallest hope, never crush the needy. And that's how we must lead. First, in a pastoral way, that is, I remember at Woodlake, we would go house to house and be with people and try to listen to their hearts and to lead out of that, so that now I was in a context where preaching was part of the stuff we did. I mean, it wasn't entirely unprogrammed, though we were open to that, but that I would do the preaching out of the experience of the people so that I know where the heart of people are and how to speak to them. And it needs to be done in a way that can shine for the world. Oh boy, wouldn't that be wonderful? Now, we can look back at wonderful leaders, but on the contemporary scene, boy, oh boy. So now, how to do all of this in the context of our day, and I don't know. I don't know that I know. And, you know, in some way, it isn't for me to know. It's for you who are leading to know now. I mean, you know, and catching a vision of what God wants to do, say in a congregation. Wow. And that builds a fire. And that's what we want to do.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. And your most recent book was on humility, right? So, I mean, I don't know why you would choose to write about that, because you know all our leadership right now is very humble. But
Yeah, right.
that's another book worth checking out.
Well, in terms of thinking about the virtues, the most fundamental, the most basic of the virtues is humility. And when I began to write, and I did a, for those who don't know, I did a kind of journal form. It was sort of a little bit of a, I don't know, stream of consciousness writing, but I didn't want to use the Western, you know, January, February, March. And a part of my background is Lakota, I'm sorry, Ojibwa. And I thought, well, let's take a look at some of the Native American calendars. And I ended up with the Lakota calendar. I just liked it. And so I thought I'd learn a little bit about Lakota culture. And of course, these are storytellers. And that's how they convey wisdom, is by telling stories. And so one of the books I got, they picked up the 12 Lakota virtues and would tell stories about that. The very first one in Lakota culture is humility. I didn't change the order or anything.
Yeah.
So I tried to learn a little bit about that and wrote a little bit about that. Why? Why would I do that? Well, number one, it's one of the crying needs of our day today. If you look at leaders, that is the virtue. Well, there are a lot of virtues that are lacking, but that one to be sure. And
Yes.
I could learn. And I also felt I was just drawn. I mean, it was just a little experiment on New Year's Eve. Now, I don't especially go for New Year's resolutions because they last about a week and a half. But I just was, Lord, is there anything I should focus on this year? It was New Year's Eve. And I just heard those two words, learn humility.
Mm.
And I thought, well, see, this is for me to learn. So I thought, well, this is a way to learn.
Yeah. I'm glad you included us in that learning process.
Yeah.
Mimi, is there any words you want to offer Quaker leaders?
Yes, I appreciate the invitation, Andy. Thank you. And for the way that you have guided our conversation today. It's really been well done. Thank you.
Mm.
The thing that I would say is words don't always persuade people, but a life does.
Mm.
And when you see somebody who's on fire, when you see somebody who is not self-focused, when you see somebody who really does, as Richard said, see and listen and hold somebody's story with them, there is something about that that names somebody at it in their core. It helps them feel seen and known and valued and cared for. And I think now, in a time when it feels like so many things are at risk and when there's so much division and loneliness and uncertainty, I think that when we go back and we do what Jesus did, because he was certainly in a culture and occupied country, he didn't stand out very much. And he actively avoided large situations. But he came alongside people, and there was something about him that was deeply compelling. So I think that maybe the Lord is calling us back to a time such as that, to just be focused on doing what we see Jesus doing and trusting that eventually over time, and Andy, I don't know that we're very aware of the change in ourselves. I don't know that we can actually feel that. Maybe as we study the ancients in particular, we see that people who have gone through purgation, illumination, and are really living in the unitive way, what they're aware of is their growing need for Christ. Their humility deepens and increases. They don't feel like they've got it made, and now they're going to be the one who goes and changes the world. Instead, they have a deep sense that they're following Jesus into situations and they're present to what he's doing. So I believe personally, this is why I think celebration of discipline is taking on a contemporary value for people who are paying attention. When we focus on Jesus, when we keep the first thing first, then second things flow out of that, and often in ways that you are not aware of yourself, because you're not focused on you. So if people would do what Jesus did, if they would embrace the rhythms and the disciplines of Jesus's life, then we have promises in scripture that that's going to be like a light in the darkness, like stars in the sky that people can navigate by. And when people see it actually alive in another person's life, and I think leadership isn't just somebody in the pulpit, leadership is a mom in the house. It's teachers, it's truck drivers, it's people who are alive with the presence of God. And that is compelling to people. So I think maybe we're in a time when we're getting things turned back around again and thinking about what is leadership. And Quakers, y'all, you have been ahead of the curve for 300 years on this. You don't shut anybody out, including kids. You don't shut anybody out. You don't shut anybody down. You don't close your ears. You're fanning the flames. And my encouragement would be to say, just keep doing what you're doing and don't get discouraged.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for those words. I want to now open it up for folks who may have questions for Richard and Mimi that they'd like to share, or just reflections from this conversation. Yeah, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I haven't read the book. I just want to say two things. One, about the word discipline. We still call Quaker Faith and Practice our book of discipline. And I'm on the revision committee of the Book of Discipline in the UK. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about that word when we come to give it a name. And the other thing, well, yeah, and on a light-hearted front, I created a card game called the Prayer Game, which has phrases and words all to do with different aspects of prayer, or what you might think prayer is, and you have to collect 4 cards that speak to you of prayer. You throw away and pick until you have them. And I remember someone throwing down discipline and someone picking it up and saying, that's just what I need. But the other thing I want to say after what you've just said, Mimi, well, what you both said, is that at Pendle Hill, I am seeing groups coming through who are so inspiring. The work that friends are doing in racial justice, in climate justice, in you name it. I mean, just one after another, these incredibly inspiring groups. We've got a group of activists in at the moment. And, you know, if this was a microcosm of the world, we'd be fine.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Good for you. Yeah.
Who else? And by the way, if you'd rather type it into the chat, feel free to do that as well. Yeah, Kevin. And hi, Jesse, as well, in the back there.
Jesse Penna and myself here at Berkeley College. I have some. There's been the three major expressions of Christianity: Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. There's more than that, but so very generalized. Do you have any words? And I'm sorry, we jumped in a little bit late. We didn't realize we missed the beginning. But do you have any? There's a new term called the nuns, people who don't identify with any 3 expressions of Christianity. Guess I'm wondering what your thoughts on that group is. Most of them are committed as Christians, but not finding the church as they experience it as a way forward. Maybe speaking to the, might I say, the irregularity of Quakers that struggle with fitting in any 3 of those places. Do you have any words about that population of people?
Go to it, Mimi.
I can't believe you just did that. I was waiting to see what you had to say, Richard, with your silver tongue.
Yeah, right.
You know, again, I would have to say, and I know maybe it's like hearing me play one note, ding, 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 on the piano. I think what is most persuasive with any group is somebody who's on fire, somebody who's fully alive. And there are so many questions, and there are ways that the church over time has behaved badly. I'm reading right now the new publication, Dallas Willard's, they pulled together, and he's talking about the scandal of the parables. And I
Mm.
just read the part where Dallas talks about the parable of the farmer who went out to sow and he sowed the seed and then everything grew. And he thought, I don't know how that happened, but look, there's fruit. And he's talking about the power of the seed, the power of the word of God. And when a life, he speaks to what we talked about a few minutes ago, Andy, about people who are trying to make something happen, which is a huge temptation,
Mhm.
and how that can do damage to somebody's soul when they think it's all about what they can do or generate or produce or do for God, do for the kingdom. And Dallas says that the seed is something that when we share it, when it comes out of a life that is rooted and grounded in the Trinity and in our own discipline of making sure that we are filled with the presence of God, with the light of Christ, that light, we can't even help reflecting it. It's just going to. It will shine out of us. We couldn't even stop it if we wanted to. And so when you run into somebody who's been damaged, or discouraged by the church, or looking around and feeling like Christians have a lot to say, but their lives don't actually measure up, there's a disconnect. When you meet somebody, this is why Richard is so dear to me. When you meet someone who is filled with Jesus, you see what's possible. And that seed begins to germinate, that image of Christ that's in them begins to germinate. So I think the most powerful thing we can do is give God more and more permission to be present in us, to offer what we have to give, and then abandon it, abandonment to divine providence, dukasad, to abandon what we just did, to let it go and let it germinate. Let the Lord work on it. Don't try to make something happen. Just offer it, release it, pray it through. But the most important work I can do is keep my own self-centered and not get pulled into a place where I feel like I have to fix something or make something happen or react or change something, but just be present to what Jesus is doing. So that may sound really, really simplistic, but again, it takes us right back to how do we do these things? The
Mhm.
disciplines.
Mhm.
We know what to do, the disciplines.
Thank you, Mimi. And that's a good word. Hi, Kevin. Oh my goodness. I didn't realize you were even there. Well, I want to say that I'm not very good at these things, but I want to say that learning, whoever it is, to be with somebody. And people who have usually been wounded in some ways, they want to be religious in a sense, but not identify with any particular group. I remember with a fellow when I was living in Oregon, he had been really wounded, and he had gone into the woods and became a potter.
Mm.
He made beautiful pots, and I would go out to where he lived, and we would sit and talk. I never tried to get him to come to anything that would mitigate against what he'd been through. But we became good friends, and he was a skilled potter. When I came to speak at that church again one time, he was there.
Uh,
And I came up to him and said how much that meant, because I knew how hard it was for him to come to a steeple house.
mm,
And anyway,
mm-hmm.
there are many, many nuns who are NON, yes, not
Mhm.
UN, uh, who who we want to just be with them. Just be with them. And it'll do what it needs to do.
Hmm.
And we don't have to worry too much about all of these statistics. If I can just be with another human being and learn from them, it'll do what needs to be done.
I like that. I live in East Tennessee, and some of the folks in my congregation are just in the community. If we tried to have a conversation about politics or theology or something, it probably wouldn't go particularly well. But one thing we have here is we have 15 chickens, laying hens that we raise, and sometimes talking about the backyard critters, the animals around here is a connecting point. And sometimes I think you've quoted him, Richard, of Thomas Merton,
Right.
the spiritual direction, and talking with that woman about her turkeys. I think it is in that case.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Is that her whole
Yeah.
life is in that? Is that what it?
Her whole life is in those turkeys.
Yeah.
Keep talking. I'll be right back.
Okay. Well, Kevin, I know he likes the saints and talking about being saints. So when you were talking, Mimi, about being on fire for Christ and such, I was thinking about, I think it's Eugene Peterson. I think he's quoting somebody else, but he says like, leading a big church is fun and all, but what most of us need is a couple good saints. And, the power of kind of having those people who are whole, and holy in
Yeah.
congregations.
That's a good word.
Well, on that topic, if I could expand that, do you think that is becoming a new future for Christianity? Is individual saints or small communities? I happened to be in a workshop with Andy, and on his book, what is it? Scarcity, abundance and scarcity. And that really is the life of a saint who finds abundance in their individuality. But you mentioned about being on fire. Oftentimes in the Protestant world, in the more charismatic expression or Pentecostal expression, it looks like outward exuberance. But is that how you would see? Would you see the saints as fitting in with that?
Boy, Kevin, that's really a great question. It'd be interesting to hear what the group feels about that. My own sense is that it's like Teresa of Avila. She says that the foundation, the core of our movement deeper and deeper into a relationship of intimacy with God is a growing humility. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Richard chose to write about humility. And I thought it was so strange. He said, I'm trying to learn about it. And I thought, you are humility. This is how we experience you, but it's not flashy, doesn't draw attention to itself. I saw Mother Teresa or Saint Teresa of Calcutta at McNichols years ago in the 80s here in Denver. She came to town, and boy, I'll tell you, the Catholics can put on a show, and they did. They had choirs and all kinds of stuff going on, and the whole floor of McNichols was filled up with seriously, severely disabled children in wheelchairs who couldn't even lift their heads. And I was up in the nosebleed section because we arrived late, a group of people from my church. And I had binoculars and I never took my eyes off her. And you know how people, when they're in front of a large group of people, you can tell by the way they move and adjust themselves that they're feeling like people are looking at them. You know what I mean? They're aware of themselves in the group and really wondering, or their image is really important. She came into that arena like a 4-year-old child holding the hand of Jesus. And all the attention, it was like go to school day, or go to work with your dad day or something. And she had a sense that the attention was not on her. She came in and she was looking around and smiling, and she sat down, and then she began looking at these children. While the whole show was going on, she looked from face to face to face, and she'd lean her head toward the side like she was hearing something. And I thought, she's listening to Jesus. And Jesus is telling her that child's name and talking about that child's soul. And she'd listen for a minute with her head tilted, and then she'd focus all of her attention on that child, and you could see her lips moving. She was praying for them. And she just went from face to face to face while this big thing was going on. And I looked at her and I said, that's what it looks like. That is what it looks like. So I don't think it's going to be a flashy person that maybe is publishing articles in the newspaper. It could be, but I think it's ordinary people that see people and listen and come alongside and pay attention and don't disregard people. But they're so present to them. Dallas was like that. When you were with him, he didn't talk about himself. Even if you asked him a personal question, what he was interested in was you. What are you seeing? How is God speaking to you? What are you hearing from Jesus? How is your longing finding expression in the place where you are? What does it look like? Teach me. I'm listening.
Mm.
And Richard is like that. I feel more myself when I'm with Richard than when I'm not. And I think that would be true of what we might call a saint. So I don't know that it's flashy. In fact, it's probably going to be pretty subversive in some ways because it's not flashy. Doesn't make the front page. But I bet every single one of us, without hesitation, could say who the one or two people in our lives have been who saw us and helped us become who we are, who named us, and we knew that they meant it.
Mm.
I'm very hopeful about what's happening in the world because I know Jesus is on the move.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The ordinary saints.
Yeah, in Nathan's book.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also think a sense of humor, I think, and Richard ends the book talking about, I think it's holiness and hilarity or humility and
Yeah.
hilarity or something like that. And inviting us to, yes, take these things seriously, but not necessarily take ourselves too seriously. And I'm thinking about Teilhard de Chardin that talks about joy being the infallible sign of God's presence. And
Very good. That really hits it. Yeah. One of the great dangers of religious people is that they can become stuffy bores.
It's true enough.
Yeah.
We just need to step out of that. That doesn't win anything. And I just think it's a lot more fun to enjoy life with people. I mean, one time, oh my, this was years ago, and I had this experience. It was on the Oregon coast. I got up very early, and I went out, and I had this incredible experience. This was I wasn't used to a beach that didn't have. There was thousands of tufted puffins, those birds, but no human beings. So I was just enjoying it. And I said it out loud, this is beautiful. And it was like there was this response. I know, I made it. And I thought, whoa, God is here. And I says, thank you, Lord. And it was almost, I mean, I don't think I could have recorded it, but it felt like there was a response. You're welcome. That was it. And then I thought, well, God is here. I think I should ask some questions. So I've got a lot of questions I wanted to ask. So I won't tell you what I asked, but I had that distinct feeling that God laughed at me. I mean, with me, but just, oh, relax. Quit trying to be so blasted religious and enjoy my presence. Never got the answer to my questions particularly, but it was one of 3 experiences that I've had like that in my lifetime. And yeah. So I thought, well, God has a great sense of humor.
Yeah. That's a good word for us. Stop trying to be so blasted religious. Is there maybe one or possibly 2 more questions? I do want to respect Mimi and Richard's time, but also it's a special opportunity. All right. Well, as we say, our heart's clear. Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Richard and Mimi, for taking the time to be with us in this special time together in conversation and lots of things to continue reflecting on. And as a reminder, folks, the book is worth celebrating. That's the title, and it is worth celebrating also. And so thanks for being together. Go in peace.
Much, Richard.
You.
Good to see you again, Mimi.
Likewise.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Mimi.
Adela, I love your smile.
You.